while I might have been dressing up as a sex clown, that I was really taking sex very seriously, and that the whole purpose was because I was doing a lecture on porn in the United Kingdom, and I did this performance art piece in clown specifically because it made everyone in the audience laugh, so they felt like their discomfort was already broken. Like, they felt like because they could all laugh at the way I was dressed, we could talk about difficult subjects very easily. And so there was actually like a psychological purpose to what I was doing. And then she was like, oh, okay, I see what you did there. Okay, that's fine. So then it was okay. So we kind of bypassed that. I thought that she just hated the fact I was a sex worker, and it wasn't that, it was that I was a sex clown. There we go. As for dating, I mean, I've been doing sex work now for 10 years, so I've definitely dated within that time, a lot. For the most part, I've had open relationships. I've found that non-monogamy is just the easiest way to have relationships when you're a sex worker, because you're having a non-monogamous relationship anyway. So it's better to just have that be very open and upfront. And so a lot of my partners have been non-monogamous themselves. I have dated other sex workers, and that's been fine, and I've had some excellent partners who have been sex workers as well. I did try dating a client once because he was really cute. That was still a bad idea, because even though there's a stigma about sex work, there is a much bigger stigma about being a client of sex work. Being the person who purchased sex work is a really big stigma. So while my friends knew how we met, his friends could never find out, which not only meant that they couldn't find out that he was a client, they couldn't find out that I was a sex worker. So I couldn't be out to any of his friends. I could never meet his family. That relationship was not going to last. And I'm sure that at some point he probably would have asked me to quit doing sex work, which was not going to happen. My last relationship was with someone in the UK, and that lasted for about 3 years. And we just met at a party, and I was very open from the start about being a sex worker, and that was fine. He was feminist and geeky and stuff, and he actually started doing porn through me. We started doing some porn together, and he went off to have his own porn career. However, I found that our relationship was very codependent and actually fairly emotionally and physically abusive in a way that I didn't really recognize while I was in it, simply because I think I didn't want to admit it to myself, which was interesting, being like a very strong-willed feminist who is very feisty and like fairly aggro, and was running this project on combating abuse in alternative sexual communities while being in an abusive relationship. And I think that part of that is, again, that sense of isolation and not really knowing how to talk about this with people, and feeling like you have to put on a front when you're in public. Like, I wanted to be the sex worker in a relationship that was working, because I wanted to prove that it could happen. And so I put up with a lot more behavior from him than I probably should have, simply because I wanted it to work so badly. Currently, I'm with somebody who is really awesome. He is also queer and non-monogamous and very submissive, so we don't have any abusive problems, which is great. And like, again, I actually just met him on OkCupid, so there you go. And he knows that I do sex work. It's not an issue. He's not jealous about it. If he feels uncomfortable with me having a client or doing a porn shoot or something, we sit down and have a conversation about it. And it would be the same if I went on a date and he felt uncomfortable about that. And if he went on a date and I felt uncomfortable, we would sit down and have a conversation as well. So does it feel any different when it's a paid date versus a non-paid date?
One of the things that Red Umbrella Project does is a monthly event we have called Red Umbrella Diaries, where sex workers are given the opportunity through us hosting this event to tell their personal stories and things that have happened to them. They have a different theme every month. They're real fun. If you ever get a chance and are in New York City on the first Thursday of a month, you should come down to the Happy Ending Lounge. That's the real name of the place, the Happy Ending Lounge, and see it. And so in the spirit of that, I'm going to tell the story of a sex worker who I know and who has given me permission to tell this story, of course, anonymously, and with all, identifying details removed. So this person is a genderqueer person of color. For those of you not familiar, genderqueer is gender identification of people who identify as neither male or female. And this person was also a sex worker and was particularly a survival street-based sex worker, but was in a very interesting situation where he was doing the survival sex work in order to support his family. His father had left his family when he was very little. They lived in projects, and his mother has a debilitating mental illness which often keeps her out of work. And then eventually she got into a relationship with a man who was an abusive alcoholic and also a police officer. This person, when this person decided to come out as a sex worker, he was kicked out of his home by his family. His boyfriend at the time broke up with him, and he was forced, even though at that point he had said the whole reason for his wanting to come out was so that he could get out of the work and get support. Because he received the absolute opposite of that, he was forced to continue doing the sex work, which he neither enjoyed nor wanted to do in any sort of way. So he was homeless for quite a few years until his family, a couple of years ago, realized that they weren't able to continue their existence without his help, without his financial inclusion into the family, and so they accepted him back, and he was able to get a job that wasn't sex work, which is the job that he currently has right now. And of course, because of that whole history that he had to go through, he has a very strained relationship with his family where he feels that he has to support them because nobody else can or will. He has a stepfather who not only is abusive to his family and an alcoholic, but also is a police officer who has threatened to arrest him and intimidated him in other sorts of ways. So I feel a lot of these sort of conferences, and we've talked about how oftentimes sex work is either portrayed as the best thing ever or it's portrayed as the worst thing ever. And these sort of conferences, because of the stigma that's generally put on sex work, we try to oftentimes make it seem like the best thing ever. And sometimes it just winds up being that because the type of people who can speak at these conferences are the type who will say that it's the best thing ever or experience it as being the best thing ever. And although we have a wonderful group of people here, which I love how diverse this group is, which is not something you see at a lot of conferences like that, this person, even if they were invited, which I'm sure they would be, he can't come to a conference like that, like this, or like any sort of other conference. He couldn't afford to take the time off work, or anything like that. So I just wanted to try to include him in some sort of way in this conference.
Well, let's see. I think from orientation, but also my coming out experience in terms of my profession and what work I wanted to do and the type of work that I do. So, you know, I came out as gay to my family. That caused some issues. There was an expectation that I would be a wealthy, heterosexual Jewish man who's going to get married and have 2 children and move into a large home in the suburbs. And that was not the case. I chose to be a social worker who works with marginalized communities, including sex workers and drug users and people with serious mental illnesses. So that's always been an interesting experience in terms of disclosure and seeing what people's reactions are to that. And I've been on dates where some guys are just like, I don't know how you do that, or you have such a good heart, you're doing really good work, and it's really demeaning and demoralizing when you hear that type of stuff. But I think I've been out in terms of being public about my sexual orientation and the work that I do for so long, and my family has become very interested in my work and supportive of my work, which is really, really great. But one client example, as Emma had shared, is I'm currently working with a sex worker who is a queer white woman and is engaged in the higher end of sex work. You know, receives quite a bit of money for her services, and she is in an intimate partner violence relationship. She's married to a man, and she has a child. And she came to me a few weeks ago in very serious crisis in her life. She was very much in danger of, you know, losing her life. And she also has supported her family through her sex work. Her husband does not work, chooses not to work, although says that he can't work because of health reasons, but I don't think that's the case. But you know, so you know, she wants to get out of sex work. She really wants to be an acupuncturist, and you know, so there's things that she wants to do, but also has felt the pressure to continue to be a sex worker and make the money that she makes in order to support the lifestyle that she lives. You know, and one of the hardest things that you know, as we've talked about before, and especially in the work that I do, is when sex workers are experiencing violence or any kind of legal issues, just the barriers that exist even for the folks that are more privileged than others who are engaging in sex work. You know, there's lots of concerns that around custody issues, that her husband is going to, you know, use her, you know, her being a sex worker as a way of fighting for custody, and I'm sure he will do that. You know, there were issues, you know, I went with her to the police precinct, you know, we called ahead and, you know, sat with her as she filed the report, and most sex workers are not going to have that person that's sitting with them saying everything's going to be okay, I promise you you're not going to get arrested, you can tell these officers whatever you need to tell them in order to get the help that you need. So, and also just in terms of who she was able to receive support from in her life. You know, she couldn't tell her parents, she couldn't tell most of her friends. You know, she ended up in a domestic violence shelter, and she would tell me about the reaction, not just separate from sex work, but just the stigma around being in an intimate partner violence relationship. You know, parents of her son's friends, and their reaction to, like, I don't want my child to hang out with your child, that kind of thing. So I've definitely seen a lot of that, and a lot of forced survival sex work as well, coercive sex work, survival sex work, family rejection as being a huge issue, and again, just the lack of access to other choices or to other resources is a huge, huge issue.
Actually, one of the things that was a big part of my abusive relationship with my ex was the fact that he had a really hard time finding a job. He was able-bodied, he didn't have any issues. He had 2 master's degrees, but there was just no work to be found for him. I think he was just really supremely unemployable. you know, because I certainly didn't have any problem finding jobs whenever I applied for jobs, but so there was definitely a resentment that he had for me doing sex work. Like, I was the person who was making all of the money, so he felt a lot of resentment that I was the breadwinner in the relationship, and that he had to ask me for things because I was the person who made all of the money. However, at the same time, like there was a definite control issue there, and because I was doing sex work, I think that also added an extra layer of resentment. So yeah, it definitely had an extra impetus in causing problems in our relationship.
Jared and Emma, can you guys discuss your work on the No Condom as Evidence campaign and kind of explain what condoms as evidence even means?
So the major campaign the Red Umbrella Project is working on right now is called, we're trying to pass a bill through the New York State Legislature called the No Condoms as Evidence Bill, Senate Bill 1379, Assembly Bill 2736. We're working on passing that bill with a group called the No Condoms as Evidence Coalition, which is a coalition of a bunch of different groups, including groups like AVP and Pros Network. Basically, the point of this legislation is to prohibit prosecutors and police from using condoms as evidence of prostitution-related misdemeanors. And that's why we're trying to pass it through the state legislature, is because most sex worker type offenses around the world are considered misdemeanor offenses, especially in the United States. And misdemeanor offenses are covered by state government and state legislation. The reason why we're trying to pass this bill is because police in the state of New York, and particularly in New York City, the NYPD, have used condoms as evidence to both stop and frisk people who they profile to be sex workers. Sometimes these are sex workers. Oftentimes they are groups that are just profiled as being sex workers, women of color, especially trans women of color, people in low-income neighborhoods, and they also stop and frisk outreach workers as well. They will destroy or confiscate the condoms the majority of the time, and then other times they will actually go ahead and arrest the person. And the majority of these cases will never be brought to trial. The evidence, including condoms, is basically held over the sex worker's head, along with the fact, or the person who's been arrested's head, along with usually their low income status and the fact that they can't afford to fight a protracted court battle to prove their innocence or to fight the blatantly bigoted nature of this practice. So they will usually make a settlement out of court. The nature of that settlement depends on the person's criminal history. So sex workers in particular are really hurt by this legislation because many sex workers have a long criminal history with multiple offenses, and so will be given very unfair plea bargains because of this.
Sure. The Pros Network published a report on condoms being used as evidence, and the work of the coalition is also framing this as a public health issue, and also an issue of this paradox of an argument that New York City is funded through the New York City Department of Health to pass out condoms, and the message, and I'm on the HIV planning group of the New York City Department of Health, which is interesting to have other advocates for the No Condoms as Evidence bill as being a part of that planning group, and kind of going back and forth in terms of arguing why this is a public health issue and why this is an issue that the Department of Health should be concerned about. So the Department of Health argues that they don't discriminate against any communities in New York, that everyone gets condoms. However, when you say that, well, the NYPD is arresting people in New York City and are using the New York City condoms that say New York City Department of Health condoms as evidence that either they've engaged in prostitution or they were intending to engage in prostitution, that kind of gets lost in the shuffle. So, so it's a really huge issue, and in New York City in particular, and across the U.S. It's not just in New York State where condoms are used as evidence, but it has created a fear throughout New York City amongst sex workers or folks that are often profiled as sex workers to carry condoms on their person, just based on fear that just one condom can be used as evidence. That if they have any condoms or any, safer sex, like lubricant or anything like that, that could be used against them if they were to be arrested. And there's also big concerns around outreach workers who are distributing New York City Department of Health condoms for them being arrested and harassed by the police. And we have gotten reports of that, and my organization that I work for, New York City Anti-Violence Project, and other folks in the PROS network have, had to look at our liability